Це 20.
Today is 24th of July, 1 year of a full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation today. My name is Vasyl Samachvalov, and our event today is attended by the representatives of Ukrainian Coalition 5 AM. This coalition unites very different and very important civil organizations which deal with different issues, but today we will be talking about the year of the war through the prism of their human rights activities. Well, before we begin, I can say about our traumatic or not so traumatic experience. We opened up in March. Foreign journalists were coming to us and they were asking, how do you work? How is your work structured? Under what ministry, under guidance of what ministry do you work? And we were saying we're a volunteer organization, we're an NGO, and they were surprised how can we work without state budget, without state support, and so on. Especially the Japanese were somehow wondered by that. So back to the idea of civil organizations, there is a hypothesis we will be talking about today, that one of the fundamentals of this systemic nature of our work is or capability of resilience in Ukraine was the civil sector, very powerful civil sector that Russia did not count on because it does not exist in Russia at all. It does not exist in the system of decision making in Russia. So how did this year pass for you, whether it's true or not? Let's start a conversation with introduction of all of our guests. First of all, it's Nadia Volkova, director of Ukrainian legal advisory group, Koval, a documentarian, coordinator of the communication department at Hounds, Yevhenii Yaroshenko, analyst at CrimeaSOS, and Kateryna Rashevska, expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights. And joining us online will be Oksana Romaniuk, executive director of the Institute of Mass Information. So I think we will start with Miss Nadia, who will give us the general picture. Right. Thank you. It's good you started with this story with Ukraine Forum and the idea. And I think that we are alike to a certain extent because all of us present here and even more organizations that are part of Ukraine 5 AM. It's more than 30 of them now, and many of them existed before the invasion, and we were working on this topic of the armed conflict. The main subject was Crimea, and that experience that we gained before the beginning of invasion, obviously it's tragically, but to a certain extent it should have happened, so it became useful so that we could unite with under joint cause the documenting of the evidences that will be used with the different mechanisms of justice for bringing to liability of those who committed and keeps committing crimes, war crimes, crimes of genocide, crimes of aggression, and crimes against humanity. And this format, it works for us in a sense that we are all different. Their level of expertise is different. We bring up different topics, and this is how we can reinforce one another. And I think it's worth mentioning that really some may perceive civil society as something that wants to substitute the state, the government, but we should be taken from a different perspective, rather as communicators, mediators, and a connection between people and the state. And we have to realize that the better we communicate the needs and the demand of the society to the state, the better we fulfill our job, our mission as the civil society. And I think that's yet another very important aspect of our coalition, and that we're trying to do it better during this last year. And as to the subject, as to the activities of our coalition, now we're at the phase where when we actively document and analyze what we've documented, but still it's important to have this information be forwarded to the mechanism that would be capable of processing it in a way that we achieve the result and we bring to reliability of those guilty and that demand for justice is satisfied. And from what we may observe today, there's a lot of different rhetorics, discussions of mechanisms, how they should work, what mechanisms are still missing, and it's important to understand here what's going on. And I think it's not that everybody has this understanding, because probably the state has one vision and people have a different vision, and some NGOs, they have yet another vision, or maybe something in between. And in my opinion, it's necessary to pay attention to those who suffered losses, to those who were severely affected by the situation, to those who try to overcome this experience with dignity, because it's the most difficult experience for all of us, but it's even more difficult for the victims of war. And it's important to pay attention to this, take it into account, and this is why we had a nationwide study, nationwide questioning, and the results were published recently. The questioning was done in partnership with the sociological group Rating and Coalition and our organization, and we wanted to ask the people what is their vision of justice, what would they want to achieve to have the mechanisms, the existing mechanisms. And we had some very interesting results, because we really found out that 96% of those affected by the war, they did not address the law enforcement agencies with their issues, and the people we were questioning, 90% they deem Russian top-level command and government officials as guilty of what happened, and 40% are the citizens of Russian Federation. And it's important to understand that those people who are awaiting for justice, they're awaiting for efficient justice, they're expecting some tangible result. And what is offered now has a number of discrepancies, shortcomings that are not capable of proper responding to the demand. So we need the mechanism, we need the reinforcement of existing mechanisms. For example, talking about the national system, we hear the statistics that the number, we hear it from the Office of Prosecutor General. We hear these statistics, the latest figure is 86,000 cases. And seeing how the system works, we understand that national system, it doesn't have proper capability for efficient investigation and bringing to liability of those guilty of crimes. And in the same way, when we communicate with the judges, we see that the court system is not in a condition that may provide for efficient investigation of those crimes. So we also ask the people whether they deem Ukrainian law enforcement and judicial system efficient. And it's interesting that 67% consider them efficient, and at the same time, when we ask them whether they are ready to address the law enforcement agencies and whether they will address the courts, whether they will sue, and whether they trust the courts, it's only 6% who trust them and 96% who are not ready to address their issues with the law enforcement system. And we have to investigate the reasons. We can talk about the reasons later, but that's a whole different topic. And talking about the International Criminal Court or Tribunal, it's not a panacea. We cannot rely on the investigations going on there, and no one can do it for us, for Ukraine. They have a limited mandate, and what Ukraine can do in these conditions is first of all to ratify the Roman Statute, to have what ICC can do, to have them do it with the full support of Ukraine being involved in all those processes, because due to non-ratification of the Roman Statute, we are only those who transfer information, who share information, who forward it to them, but there is no active participation in decision making as to the budgets, as to the choice of judges, prosecutors, of those who will be investigating the case. With regard to Ukraine, we don't have that right, and what we declare now, that the rule of law is a top one priority for us, that we are a law-based state, that we follow international law, international standards. Non-ratification of Roman Statute says quite the opposite. As to all the international aid, we observe that to the extent of the involvement of our international partners, specifically in the aspects of justice, the problem is that all the experts, well, maybe not all of them, but the majority of them, of those coming to us, they don't fully understand the context. I don't mean the security context, but I mean more the context of in which we operate, in which the judges, the courts, and the judicial system operate. The infrastructure doesn't let us do those investigations or even take into account their expert opinion, their advice. We don't have proper sources. No funds are allocated from the budget for the work of judges and law enforcement agencies. We were communicating judges and the conditions they work in. I don't know how can we ensure justice, not let alone the justice in relation to the heaviest crimes. And I think that in this context it's important to hear the civil society with kind of analytics like this, because telling all the time how efficient we are in our job, how many documented crimes we have, it's good, but at the same time there should be some critical analysis, critical assessment of what's going on, because all in all we risk to have the expectations and the hopes of those affected by the war not to be satisfied. Thank you for this remark about the context, because during the first month we understand that our main fighting is for understanding of context, political context, military context, cultural context, information context, because without disclosing the context it's difficult for the foreign journalists to understand what's going on really here. Mr. Roman, what's your area of responsibility? How was this year for you? Who is the state for you, whether it's a competitor or an ally or a partner? Good afternoon, everybody. I represent the organization Hounds. We document the war crimes and international and crimes against humanity. Since 2014 we document the crimes, and it's an essential thing on a way for achievement of justice and bringing those guilty of international crimes to liability. The documentarians, while documenting the incidents, has to answer two questions: whether the incident they talk about with the affected person, was it a war crime, and who committed it, and then they launched the process with the material brought from the fields, as we say, something that was documented in the field. So how it happens? Are they the videos, the photos, or whether it's written on paper? Usually it's a team of two people. One acts as an interviewer and another one documents everything as a text. It's more convenient so that we can make the evidence more precise, because you cannot show the video to the witness and then correct it and reshoot it, but you can read the text and make some you can have the witness read the text and make some corrections. Now there are 29th and 30th missions going on in Kharkiv, in Kherson regions. For comparison, before the full-scale invasion, we had 5 to 7 field missions per year. We have a team of monitors who, within this year of full-scale invasion, documented more than 4,000 incidents that have indicators of war crimes. During 30 field missions, we gathered about 380 evidences from direct witnesses and the persons directly affected. So the scale is tremendous, and to cover all this scale we can only do it having joined our forces, having joined our efforts. So it's different vectors of efforts, the efforts of civil organizations, the colleagues who are present here, or those who are part of our coalitions but are not present here, and the state, obviously. Talking about the efforts of coalition in documenting, we all joined our efforts, and many organizations which were not documenting the war crimes, they started learning how to do it, they started undergoing trainings, they started to learn to collect the evidences of war crimes in a way that they don't lose their evidence nature. On this way of joining our efforts in documenting, we came up to an important decision. We use the iDoc database as the main storage of information, data, and evidences that are collected by the documentarians of different organizations. It's not being shared in Google Drives. It's all collected in one single joint database. There is a big team of analysts who break down this information into different profiles, the profiles of those affected, the descriptions of the incidents, the defendants, and there is a storage with relation for divided by any organization. It's very efficient, and it's an important step that demonstrates the joint effort of the coalition for search of those guilty of war crimes. As to the state, obviously Ukraine will be, and it is, the main actor in bringing to liability of those guilty and in investigation of the crimes. The Ukrainian prosecutor's office, not only general prosecutor but all across Ukraine, they bear the main burden, the main massive of the cases that are being opened in compliance with the Article 438 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. But obviously Ukraine cannot, regardless of the fact that our justice system is functional. We just cannot cope with this amount of war crimes. This is why the efforts of coalition are directed outside to different international actors, not only International Criminal Court, but a possible special tribunal for Russian-Ukrainian war, which will most probably be created shortly. But those are the law enforcement systems of different countries who may use the mechanism of universal jurisdiction and bring to liability, because I will explain you the international crimes, the severity of the crimes allows to cross the borders of jurisdictions, and this is the principle of universal jurisdiction. And prosecutors of Germany and France, for example, they may undertake responsibility for investigation of certain crimes. We're talking about the crimes, the war crimes, yes. And we continue working on those creation of those horizontal ties between the law enforcement systems of European, so far only European countries, and we hope to expand this process to other continents. The final goal of documenting, I'll be wrapping up with what I started, is bringing to liability of those who are guilty of war crimes. Is just one of the links of this chain, and the fundamental of this link is the success, because it defines the significance of other steps, because otherwise they lose the logic of actions. If the crime is documented in improper way, and what we do, it allows us not to do the double work. We coordinate with law enforcement agencies, we coordinate with each other for these field missions, and it allows us to identify the spots on the map where it makes sense going, where nobody went before. And it's very important to emphasize that this coordination also allows us to not re-traumatize the witnesses, not to disturb the same people twice, not to bring them back into that condition when we have to ask them twice about their traumatic experience, or have them tell about their traumatic experience several times. And thanks to this, we can do most effective job in documenting and provide the result for the state and stimulate the movement of this process in a very proper manner. It was important to hear that the civil society fills the lacuna of for where government or state is empty to document all of it. So let's have Oksana Romaniuk, the director of Institute of Mass Information, join us online. So let's talk about information and misinformation and everything in between. Good afternoon, Miss Oksana. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's my honor to be in this company of right defenders who document the Russian war crimes, and I'm convinced we will see Russian criminals in international tribunal, and we will be sitting there in the hall and seeing them being brought to fair justice, and I'm sure our joint effort will contribute to it. We announced the results of a monitoring of war crimes against journalists and media. We documented 497 cases when Russia destroyed purposefully, was launching missiles or rockets at the TV towers, killing journalists, tortured journalists, persecuted them, oppressed, and kept them hostages. And since the beginning of this year, 48 of our colleagues perished, including 8 of them who perished during the performance of their professional duties. and the rest died either in the ranks of armed forces or as a result of shellings or tortures. And all of our colleagues could be alive, they could continue doing their investigations. I just want to pay honor to those who perished, and this is why I think that this work with documenting of war crimes is utmostly important. And apart from documenting the crimes related to physical aspects of aggression, it's also important to document the crimes related to propaganda. A year ago, before the full-scale invasion, we were using the term misinformation, and when we were talking to our international colleagues, they said that no liability should result in any liability. What if your neighbor reposts any information about COVID or something like that, which is not true? And now we understand that Russian misinformation is a part of Russian military doctrine. It's a part of Russian plan of invasion, of capturing of Ukrainian territories. Now we don't use the term misinformation, we use the term genocide rhetorics, because they are the direct calls to genocide of Ukrainians, the extremist statements made by Putin himself and by the information network controlled by the Kremlin. We identify and document it now, and we want to see those who use genocide rhetorics, we want to see them in the international tribunal. Those are the people who deny the identity of Ukrainians, who call to bombing civil cities, civil infrastructure, who call to kidnapping of Ukrainian children and hand them to Russian families. There was the concert recently in Luzhniki where kidnapped children from Mariupol who were sitting in the shelters. They were used just as a PR elephants to have those children walk out on the scene and say how thankful they are to Russia for saving their lives. Those children are being changed their names, they are being handed to Russian families and completely eliminating their identities. So in his public addresses, Putin calls to destroy Ukrainian identity. He says Ukrainians do not exist, so it's a crime of genocide, and our documenting is directed at genocide rhetorics now in one aspect, and in another aspect we want to describe the calls of the propagandists as the crime of aggression. And it's a big task for the future, because the crime of aggression does not have, the definition of crime of aggression does not have an information component now. So on practice we collect the data to understand how to describe it properly and how to make it so that the people who were performing this act of aggression, this crime of aggression, so that they are fairly punished. And we coordinate a lot with our colleagues. We develop, because previously we did not even imagine that we will have to do this kind of job. We were dealing with professional registration of journalists inside Ukraine. But today we face new challenges that we have to work with, and I'm happy that here in Kyiv today we keep working, and I'm convinced we will win. Well, the history of humanity knows when the propagandists were brought to liability. Do we have an understanding what should be the legal road to bring Skabeva and Kisilov, or God forbid Diana Panchenko, to how they could be brought to liability? Yes, we go in two ways, in the national and international level. On the national level, we cooperate with the Office of Prosecutor General. We have a dedicated team for For those who deal with the genocide rhetorics, we exchange information, and Ukrainian law enforcement initiates cases and sanctions against those people. Sanctions are not enough, but they are still an important component. We hope on the creation of a new international tribunal, as my colleague mentioned, and there are several cases related to the crimes against media and journalists. They were forwarded to international court. It was a killing of the murder of Max Levin, and the shelling of TV towers. All the methods that we can use, we should use them, both universal jurisdiction and international criminal court, but we have most hopes on the new tribunal, which will be related to Ukraine exclusively, because when ICC was created, no one was expecting. Well, we have new challenges. We have the situation which requires obviously a separate international dedicated tribunal. Thank you. We will get back to our guest in the studio, Ms. Yevhenii. Maybe a question to you, because the matter of it's about Crimea, the issue of Crimea did not arise a year ago, but what changed in your area of responsibility in your work comparing to previous periods, and getting back to the way of your cooperation with the state? How do you work? What's the structure of your work? Good afternoon. I would like to mention that the war is going on not for a year, but it's on for 9 years, and the beginning of the war was the events in Crimea in the beginning of 2014. That there is a lot of evidences, first of which is the Russian model for return of Crimea, and the report of the prosecutors of International Criminal Court. They're all the evidences of beginning of the war. So how did the situation change within last year? If before the February 24, Crimea was the island of peninsula of fear, propaganda, and oppression, it became a platform for the full-scale invasion of continental Ukraine. The full-scale war did not only change the continental part of Ukrainian society, it changed Crimeans too. If before 24th of February many pro-Ukrainian inhabitants of Crimea were losing the hope that Crimea would ever come back to Ukraine, but thanks to the heroism of Ukrainian armed forces, they got this idea that the Ukrainian flag above Crimea is only a matter of time, and the war became the push to the deterioration of situation with the human rights in Crimea. I would like to stop at a couple of more noticeable things. There are violations of human rights which were not noticeable before. The occupiers started using the civilians as the life shield. First of all, during the first days of the invasion, when they were launching missiles on the continental Ukraine, the launching sites were in the yards of the residential buildings, which is obviously war crimes. Also, the occupiers were using the civil hospitals for the needs of the wounded and killed Russian military, which resulted in the inability of which resulted in the fact that the inhabitants of the northern part of Crimea were deprived of opportunity to use free medical services. And since Crimea became a platform for the invasion, it became the platform for the crimes committed both in continental Ukraine and in peninsula too, crimes against human rights. There's a lot of civilians kidnapped by the Russian law enforcement and Russian military. Those Ukrainians who were kidnapped in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, they ended up in Crimea. According to the data, according to the information of human rights protection organizations, there are more than 700 Ukrainians being in confinement cells in Crimea in Simferopol, and the majority of them are being detained there without any accusations. They have no access to the lawyers. They are deprived of any communication with the outer world, and almost single source of information and confirmation that they are being detained in Simferopol confinement cells are the words of those who share that cells with them through their barristers. And this is how the CrimeaSOS found out that these are those persons kidnapped in the south of Ukraine are currently in occupied Crimea. It's worth mentioning that in October the occupiers opened a new confinement compound in Simferopol. It's because the repressive machine of Russian Federation, for the repressive machine of Russian Federation, one confinement compound is not enough in Simferopol, and it's being filled by the people kidnapped in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions mainly. Obviously, the tortures are still going on, both in Crimea and torturing of those who were kidnapped in the south of Ukraine, of continental Ukraine. We may hear news about what such citizens of Ukraine as Alexei Kiselov, Rustem Osmanov, Ruslan Abdurrahmanov, what they survived, non-human, brutal tortures. I don't even know how they made it alive after that. Even in the conditions of the confinement cells, they were provided almost no medical aid. Crimea became also a platform for maraudery. First of all, the murder of grain. According to the journalist investigations, Russia stole more than 600 tons of grain, which was mostly sent to Syria. And in the open sources, we can also find information about Russian Syrian vessels which were stealing the Ukrainian grain. This is why the matter of sanctions, the issue of sanctions against those vessels and their owners, should be reviewed by the international courts, and there should be no impunity in this case. And in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and specifically on the 4th of March, there were amendments adopted to the Russian Federation legislation and criminal code of Russian Federation that Russia applies in Crimea to the contrary to the international law. One of such amendments is the liability for discrediting of Russian army. According to our calculations, since March 4 until the end of 2022, 234 cases were heard by the courts of Crimea. In 184 cases, the persons were convicted of those crimes and penalized for 30,000 rubles. Mostly those were the captions on the writing on the walls, like "No to War" or slogans "Glory to Ukraine." This is what people were convicted of. So those were only the opinions of what's going on. There was no real crime. And one of the instruments of repression, new instruments of repressions, is the article for criminal liability for the fakes about Russian army. According to different sources during this time, at least 2 criminal cases were initiated pursuant to that article. One was in regard of the person who wrote on the fence of their relative, that person who is a part of Rosgvardia, that he is a war criminal. So the person was convicted for 2.5 years in prison. Another case for discreditation of Russian army was in relation to a professor of Belagirsk professional school. And according to the Russian legislation, if a person is being brought for liability twice within a year for so the second administrative violation becomes criminal violation. And lastly, at the end of the last year, there was unprecedented pressure on the lawyers, on the advocates. A number of advocates spent a few days under administrative arrest for illegal location of citizens in indefinite, in unidentified place, and the advocates who protect the victims of political repressions were deprived of advocate licenses, and it means that there is a more burden on the advocate community, because there's less independent advocates which can be relied on by the victims of the violations of human rights. And there were waves of mass searches in the homes of Crimean Tatars in February and August last year. The mobile phones of many advocates were blocked, which resulted in the fact that the victims could not contact them in a timely manner, and the advocates could not come and provide and extend their professional aid. And there are some things going on in Crimea which happen regardless of the full-scale invasion. Those are random searches. According to different sources, there were more than 50 searches with the Witnesses of Jehovah. Russia recognized this organization as extremist organization. The detentions are still going on. There were 2 waves of searches related to Hizb al-Tahrir, and they all result in Ukrainian citizens and ending up behind the bars as after some politically motivated accusations. At least 57 persons were convicted for 699 years and 9 months in total. The aggregate sentence for them was this long, and at least 17 persons were accused of were accused of political crimes and forwarded to Russian colonies in Russia. First it was in Bashkortostan, now it's also Yeniseisk in Russian Federation. And the last statement is that the reaction of international community is not sufficient to what Russia has done in the year 2014 in Crimea and Donbass, and it created the favorable environment for the invasion and new atrocities that happened in Bucha, Mariupol, Irpin, and other places all across Ukraine. And those atrocities will most likely continue just as long as Russian forces are in Ukraine. And as an experience of work of human rights organizations in Crimea, we were convinced about that way before the full-scale invasion, that the sanction pressure, the diplomatic pressure on Russia did not result in them ceasing any such activities. So the only way to stop those crimes against humanity, the severe violations of the human rights, it may only stop when Leopard and Abrams tanks reach Crimea. Thank you, thank you. We've heard an important thought that the compromise with the evil only brings more evil. So Ms. Kateryna, what was your cooperation with the state? I think that I will contribute to the statements of my colleagues in a harmonious manner. We, as a regional center for human rights, were a Crimean organization before 2022, and in 2022, apart from the complex research as to the genocide committed by Russian Federation against the Ukrainian nation, we had a study of how the politics of persuading the aggressor with a way of territorial concessions and sanctions resulted in what we got on the 24th of February 2022. The one and single example that impresses me in the most painfully is that regardless of the embargo imposed and supported by the and that the European countries were trying to find a way around that embargo only started working in 2020, and it was embargo on the arms, which arms are currently used against Ukraine, and they were used for initiation of the full-scale invasion. I would also like to pay attention to one of the subjects that my organization deals with. It's a subject of the forced handing of Ukrainian children to Russian families, and there is a lot of space for cooperation with the state bodies of Ukraine, the international organizations. What we actually do in 2022, we submitted our notification to International Criminal Court as to the activities of Maria Lvova-Belova, who is Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia. We all know it perfectly well that she adopted a boy named Philip, and maybe someone even paid attention that during the last meeting with President Putin, Maria Lvova-Belova a little bit forgot or intentionally manipulated the age of Philip, having said that he was 15. At the same time, she was saying a year before that Philip was 16, and comparing the information she was submitting before, well, he was 17 actually, since she said that Philip lost his mother in 2017 at the age of 11. So I think that the purpose of such distortion of information, which is overwhelming and everywhere, that they change the personal data of the children all the time, and there is no single procedure for the children deported from Ukraine to Russian Federation. I want this to be understood, and Maria Lvova-Belova witnesses it by herself, and the registers of DPR and LPR, and that and of those children kidnapped by the Russians from orphan houses in newly occupied territories, they are being unified with the federal database of orphan children of Russian Federation. And now, to identify such children, to trace their families where they were handed to, and to repatriate them in Ukraine, we will need just titanic efforts. So you want to say that they rewrite the documents completely? I cannot guarantee it, because I'm not involved in this criminal process, because we have documented cases when they were changing personal details of the children during their deportation to the re-education camps, so that they don't get the consent of their parents. They were changing their age, and they were moving children to Crimea, and children were detained there without the possibility to come back, because they were no children anymore, and their freedom of movement was restricted by Russian Federation. So all those manipulations with personal details, age, and so on, I re-emphasized it a number of times even here, that there are small children who cannot even remember their names due to the trauma they received, and we have problems with identification of children now, and this is number one problem that is posed in front of the state, and we have to solve it. But we have more than 16,000 identified children. There is an information about them in the portal Children of War, but this information remains in the portal instead of being forwarded to competent agencies, maybe international agencies, or maybe in cooperation with ICRC or UNICEF, to develop a mechanism, a legal mechanism for returning of such kids. We cannot wait a year or two before the war is over, until the war is over, or the crayfish whistles on the mountain. Those children, they reach the age of 18 years, which means the forced conscription for the boys. This is why Maria Lvova-Belova said that Philip is 15 to avoid probably his forced mobilization in a year. And with regard of other pretexts that Russia Federation uses to deport Ukrainian children that I would like to draw your attention to, it's recently invented dispensarization. There is no legal base for it, and we thought it was a resolution by Putin, but it's impossible to find any such resolution. It was his decree to the Ministry of Health of Russian Federation, but there is no such legal document in the database of Ministry of Health of Ukraine. So it's the unconsented medical intervention of incomprehensible nature in the lives of Ukrainian kids. So the Russian doctors were coming to occupied Ukrainian territories and committing some actions with regard to Ukrainian kids. And in the territory of so-called DPR, 113,000 people are subject to medical intervention now. And the Minister of Health of so-called LPR, they say that they can do it on the platform of the clinical hospital of Luhansk, and they have the statistics that they can accept 7,000 kids, and meanwhile it's 112,000 children who are subject to such medical intervention. It would take 16 years, and such children would be forced to be deported to Russian Federation. And it all happens now, or it used to happen before, so I cannot say there was any consent by the parents. It's only one option there. You whether risk being deprived of the parents' rights, or you voluntarily hand your child to that dispensarization. And we unfortunately cannot document any statistics as to the number of kids being handed to Russian families since 2023, but now we know this figure is 400 children, and 223 children from LPR could potentially be forcibly moved to Russian families, relocated to Russian families. But again, this information is very difficult to access now, and I would like to pay attention to the role of Crimea in this process. When we talk about the re-education camps, I would say those are the militarization and indoctrination and Russification camps, and to some of these camps the children were relocated without consent of their parents or based on the counterfeit documents, or around 200 children were relocated to such camps without any consent whatsoever. It's 7 such camps in Crimea and 43 under effective control of Russian Federation in total, and of them more than 20 are in very remote places. Your child may be going to Vladivostok to get Russified, or there is another option with Belarus. When the Yale School of Public Health published their research, they did not mention Belarus. However, within the years 2021-2022, more than 5,000 Ukrainian kids were visiting 4 re-education camps there in compliance, contrary to the standards of the international law. So they were developing those programs, those plans, way before the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And if we see whether Ukrainian children were deported to Belarus and Russian Federation before, yes, they did it, and it's at least 500 children that we may trace who were visiting Russian re-education camps in 2021, and I'm personally frightened by the plans for 2023. They're not wrapping up this policy, and there is a titanic effort to be taken to bring our children back, and some parents cannot even do it because they remain in the occupied territories without any resources, or Russia directly impedes them to take their children back, specifically when they deal with some talented children. They are being located in special camps, and Russian Federation offers or promises some bright future for such kids who have some achievements in sport. For example, they may attend Olympic Games on behalf of Russia, and this will be the kids from the newly occupied territories, because this is what Mishustin said in one of his interviews, that the preference will be given to the children from the newly occupied territories. Last year it was only 30,000 children like those who visited Russian re-education camps in 2022, but the consequences, we can only think about the consequences of such events, but it's the eradication of Ukrainian identity, and it's so-called occupation of their brains, and they are being told that probably the proper way for Ukraine is not European integration, but friendship with Russia. But I had an opportunity to talk to some kids who returned from such places, re-education camps. Russia doesn't really make it. The children continue to hate Putin. They continue crying out glory to Ukraine, even regardless of any punishments that were applied in their regard. If we have any questions in the studio, in the floor, Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. Miss Nadia, what are the prospects of ratification of Roman Statute? Well, thank you for this question. The prospects are none for today, because the government refuses to do so. Rhetoric is such that we will do everything after the war, but as our experience confirms, nothing would be done after the war. And in the study that I mentioned, we asked the question from those being questioned, how, to what extent do they support ratification, and it turned out that only 30% know and understand what Roman Statute is, and among those 30%, the support for ratification is 79%. So it's clear that the more people we know will know about what International Criminal Court and Roman Statute is, the more such support will grow. But I think that this result is very demonstrative, and there is no fear in the military, in the society. Our partners from Organization of Civil Space who support the veterans and our fighters, we had the question among in their focus groups, and there is almost 100% support among the military. So it's a myth that we cannot ratify it because our military will refuse to fight. Well, that's not quite true. However, the myth is deeply rooted. I apologize. Thank you very much, Mr. Roman. The next question is to you. You mentioned that you deal with telling how to collect the evidences in a proper way. So what should the interviewer do, and what to do if the witness somehow doesn't want to provide any evidences? Should you step back, or there are mechanisms to make them talk, so to say? Thank you for your question. Well, everybody should, well, the witnesses should clearly understand what process it is and what is it for. Before each interview, we explain that we're not reporters, we're no journalists. Our main task is the work with the law enforcement agencies, and people usually, after they start understanding in full, after they are fully informed, they give their consent to talk. And in the end of every interview, we offer to sign the so-called power of attorney that allows us to use the information, to hand this information they provided to international court, to international prosecutors or Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, or elsewhere, and every documentarian should follow some methodology. It's a different, it's a whole separate document, and they should undergo a number of trainings, and having those methodological skills, they the level of a documentarian reduces if they commit some mistakes in questioning. And for example, one of the ways to make photos and videos which may be used in the course then is to use the software Eyewitness. It's the cell phone application. You make pictures of the consequences of the shelling, and if a documentarian ends up in a situation when their phones are being checked or else, there is a password in Eyewitness, and if you enter incorrect password, you are being forwarded to the regular gallery, and if you enter the correct password, you are being forwarded to the locked Eyewitness folder. So it allows to keep those evidences in this proper way. And my last question is to Mr. Yevhen. Mr. Yevhen, what do the international partners and our human rights protectors do to have people out of confinement cells in Crimea? It's a difficult question because sometimes we're lacking verified information about the number of people detained. The figures are very different with the human rights protection organizations, and some organizations they may have different figures, and law enforcement agencies have yet another figure. So it's important to identify a number of those who are being kept civil hostages in Crimea, and to identify them as persons, their names. Another challenge is when a person is being detained without any accusation, and in that way they are deprived of any access to the lawyers, and it frequently happens so that a person is being initiated a case against them, and they find out about it later, and when the person is in some incommunicado state, they may be used some repercussions against. And we see that international organizations unfortunately are inefficient in the matters of those who are being detained in the occupied territories, and specifically in Crimea. It was noticeable since 2014. The International Committee of Red Cross, who is the guarantor of adherence to the international humanitarian law, was never observed being involved in rescuing the victims of the war. And within all those years of occupation of Crimea, there were only 2 visits of the representatives of Council of Europe to Crimea, and the United Nations mission for monitoring of human rights is not active in Crimea. Well, it is, but it only on paper. And the lack of access to the territory complicates things a lot. And in my opinion, the liberation of those detained requires a combination of instruments, including military instruments. The more powerful the victories of the Ukrainian armed forces, the better is our negotiations positions for liberation of those detained, and diplomatic efforts and persecutions of those who are involved in those atrocities, and obviously publicity. It's necessary to have a public person behind every one single prisoner that would recall their names during any of their addresses. And when we talk about political prisoners, there are many American, Polish, Italian, British politicians who advocate the liberation of such persons as Usman Rifmetran, Savman Saliyev, Marlen Asanov. And in the same way, when we talk about Sergei Tsigipa, Andrei Golubev, and others who were unlucky to end up imprisoned by Russian world, they should all be, their names should be recalled by such politicians. Well, there are more questions.
From Rise News. Why are Ukrainians so reluctant to come forward to give evidence? My understanding is that Ukrainians are reluctant to give evidence as witnesses. Why are they so reluctant?
Reluctant to give evidence is that they don't feel like they understand how the state can help them when they report the crimes or alleged crimes that happen to them. So that means that they're not aware of the remedies that they can get. They know that it's going to take a long time, and they don't know what the result's going to be. And to be honest, it's fair, I think.
I would like just add that, for example, there are several categories of victims who, for example, are not ready to speak now when we are talking about victims of sexual and gender-based violence, for example. And also when we are talking about children deported to Russia, there are children who are orphans or children deprived of parental care or children which parents were killed during this Russian aggression. So there is no one who can go to our police, who can apply in order to return these children, in order to help them, in order to obtain special status for them, and so on. So we should take it into account, because some victims need parents patria from our state. Ukraine should help them.
And the last point is security. For example, we work in different cities like Dnipro, Zaporizhia. It's big Okriviri. It's places where like hubs for those who are evacuating from temporarily occupied territories. And for a lot of victims or witnesses, it's relevant that they have relatives, children, parents, friends staying in occupation. And they are basically afraid to talk just because of the security measures.
Маю дуже стисло тоді від себе питання, і будемо завершувати. А як ви...
What's your overall assessment of the support of international human rights organizations like Human Rights or Red Cross? How do they support? To what extent do they help in Ukraine? Who would be the first? Well, really, I think that it's a matter of expectations. For example, we built our activity upon the partnership with international organizations, and there are some organizations which have very powerful experience, and they may become guides for us. However, we have to understand that their capabilities, their understanding is quite limited, and it's wrong to, it's naive to expect that they will come and explain everything to us and they will do it for us. We have to understand that we have our responsibilities. We can use their advice, but through the prism of our understanding, our experience, and our context. So I think that the problem is in this, and another problem is that there is no understanding of the mandate of the Red Cross, for example, absolutely what they can and what they cannot, and using that what they can do, we have to know how to use it, because it's easy to say that they're inefficient. I want to mention that the role of NGOs, the civil organizations, I appreciate their interest and their attempts to help. We enter into different kinds of cooperations with different NGOs, for example, for the crimes in Severinivka, together with International Partnership for Human Rights, the Brussels-based organization, we issued a report. And I was talking about the universal jurisdiction, and an important step to make it happen is that we started actively communicating with Genocide Network, and without that communication any advancements would be way more difficult. And the role of international organizations for human rights is very significant, and we have to keep their attention and to build the constructive dialogue with them. I would just like to add to what Nadia mentioned, that the role of ICRC is being extensively discussed in Ukraine, but in some cases the governments like to make a scapegoat out of the ICRC, because they put the burden of their responsibilities contemplated by Geneva Conventions and the protocols to it on the shoulders of the ICRC. So the responsibility of Russian Federation in case of so-called evacuation, in actual deportation of children to Russian Federation, well, the Russians' responsibility is the drawing up of the information card for every single child, and this card, each and every such card should be communicated to RCRC. Russia obviously doesn't do it, and now we're saying why RCRC doesn't support us in the report of Ukrainian children to Russian Federation. They cannot do it, first of all, because Russia does not adhere to their responsibility to do this, but I've heard about the distortion of this responsibility of Russia by our international partners, who say that it's responsibility of Ukraine to pass information of this kind to ICRC. Meanwhile, is the responsibility of the aggressor state, in our case is the responsibility of the state which deports the children. So there is a lack of understanding of the mandate of ICRC and the lack of understanding of structure of ICRC, since what operates in Russian Federation is not the International Committee of Red Cross, and we will not directly communicate with those who worked in Russian Federation, and if we do so, we will only do it through their office in Geneva. So this should be accounted before you criticize somebody. Thanks a lot. Today is the 24th of February, the day when we commemorate the anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Russia. We were visited by Coalition Ukraine 5 AM, and we were talking about how the civil sector helps Ukraine in their victory. We will see you on Monday. Thank you.